want to show your faces. We'd love to see them, and the panelists would love to see you. We wanted to welcome you to our second alumni career panel. This was, and just a tiny background on this, this is part of a joint effort with Career Services, Advancement, the Alumni Association, and the Graduate School aimed at helping our graduate students thinking about careers outside of academia. We know that in a lot of ways the ground has shifted underneath you in terms of what you might have been thinking was potentially an academic career when you started your graduate degree, or maybe even when you started, you always thought that you were going to go out into a career outside of academia. And we know that there are lots of wonderful services that the Career Services Office offers and that your own department provides as well. But we wanted to give you this opportunity to meet some successful alums who work in specific areas. And today, of course, it's the area of health sciences and health science careers. And we, of course, wanted a variety of different kinds of careers, different kinds of degrees that led to careers in health sciences. So that's why we brought in this really great group of panelists this morning. So what I'm going to do is introduce each one and let them talk for a minute or two about their career trajectory, what they studied at CU, and then of course, how that led to where they are today. I'll then begin with a question or two for our panelists, but if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and either Kat or I will ask the questions of our panelists. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to remind folks of or tell you about before we begin. I can't think of anything, but I'm sure Sarah or Kat will remind me. And so without further ado, let me start with our first panelist, Frank Brennan. Frank, please introduce yourself.
All right, thank you, Dean Adler. Can you hear me? All right, good morning, everybody. So I'm Frank Brennan. I graduated from CU in 1994 with a PhD in behavioral neuroscience, part of the psychology department. I'll keep this to a minute or two, but I've had some interesting turns in my career. I'm happy to answer questions as we go through. I've been a full-time faculty member at a small college. I've been a researcher with the government, with the VA. I've been a scientist in industry, and for the last 8 years or so, been in medical affairs, which is, you might say, what's medical affairs? I work for Amgen, big biotech pharmaceutical company. So every pharmaceutical company has a medical affairs team. We're not sales, we don't do sales, but we're field-based clinical scientific experts. So I'm in neurology, but there's all different therapeutic areas. And we're out there to answer the questions that the physicians might have about the drug, about the clinical trials, about, so you have a territory, you have people that you call on, but again, it's a scientific, clinical, educational kind of role. Obviously, my background in neuroscience at CU, I'm currently in the neurology space with Amgen, is exceedingly helpful. And I think it's actually, I had never heard of the job 10 years ago, to be honest, but I think it's growing, and it's really a possibility for a lot of people with doctorates who don't want to do academia or can't do academia. So that's me.
Thank you, Frank, and it's really a pleasure to have you. Our next is Joanna Lowell. Joanna?
Hi, everyone. I thought I'd start where I am and then how I got here. I work for something called the Demographic and Health Surveys Program, which is a project that's funded by the US government through USAID, the development arm of the State Department. But I work for a private company, and there's actually a sort of consortium of companies that together run this project. What does it do? My elevator pitch is, say you come across a statistic, like, I'm making up this data, but let's say the average woman in Liberia has 4.7 children, or the prevalence of HIV in the kingdom of Lesotho is 25% among adults. You might say, interesting, followed by, wait a minute, how should I believe that? Where does that information come from? And the way, in the US that you get that information is because things are recorded. There's good medical records, generally speaking. But in much of the world, that's not the case. And so they rely on surveys, health surveys, to collect from a sample of households information that then can be used to generate statistics for the country, for provinces, et cetera. So what the group I work for does is we provide technical assistance. We work with statistical agencies and departments of health in countries, or in low and middle income countries around the world, and help them carry out high quality surveys measuring this sort of thing and many, many other types of indicators, from everything from vaccinations to malaria related things, et cetera. My role at the organization for many years, I've been there 11 years, was as a survey manager. So I would be a point person supporting, working very closely with and traveling to countries to help them carry out health survey. So that's a long way away from where I started when I was at CU. I graduated in 1998 with a PhD in chemistry. I focused on biochemistry and molecular biology. So how did I get from there to here? After getting my PhD, I did what a lot of people do. I did a postdoc because I felt like I'd been trained. I had all this experience, and I'm a lab scientist. And I worked at Rockefeller University in New York City, studying an organism that was disease causing, as opposed to what I did my graduate work on, which was tangentially cancer related. But I was working on yeast. And then after I did a long postdoc, 6 years there, I love living in New York, but I just didn't see myself going on and running, having an academic position. Frankly, I had neither the CV nor really the desire. So I was looking for other opportunities, but I'd always been interested in public health. And I talked to a bunch of people, I talked to 20 people, and just got the impression that it wouldn't be a mistake to get a master's in public health. So that's what I did. I got a master's in public health at Johns Hopkins. And from there, took a job at a small not-for-profit that was trying to get small pharma, biotech companies involved in making drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics for neglected tropical diseases. Did that for a couple of years. And then from there, ended up working at the Demographic and Health Surveys program, where my job, what's great about it is that I get to do a lot of different things and call on my scientific training in the sense of sort of being very detail oriented and helping ensure high quality. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joanna. That's great. And again, a pleasure to have you here. Our next is Don Mestis. Don?
Hi, so I'm Don Mestis, and my career has actually been a little bit different. Currently, right now, I'm doing a couple different things. I provide direct care service for people, primarily with individuals with anxiety. I also do a lot of consulting with businesses. Mostly I'm working with executives trying to figure out ways to be a little bit more strategic in providing care and really identifying barriers for care that clients usually run up against. Additionally, we have our own small startup, primarily, again, trying to address barriers. So we're trying to provide grief support services to individuals who otherwise might not be able or willing to ask for help. So we're trying to look at technologies and way to do that innovatively. Beyond that, most of my career has been in community mental health. I started out, with a BA from CU in philosophy and a ton of psychology work, and sort of, again, just sort of followed my heart, followed my passion. And as I worked through that, continued to look for opportunities, got a master's in counseling and ultimately an MBA. And again, same thing, working child services, child crisis, always though with this theme of what are the barriers for people getting the proper care, and really trying to figure out ways to work both through treatment levels, but also through systems. I think in the community, there are a lot of barriers, and I think when you're inside, it all makes sense. When you're a client, you constantly feel frustrated. So trying to take that perspective and really be more creative. And with the onset of technology, really rethink some of the assumptions we've had in the past. So that's basically where I'm at.
Thank you, Don. And it's great to have you with us this morning. We appreciate your time. And finally, our last panelist is going old school. He's on the phone because of some connectivity issues. Todd McIntyre. So Todd, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Todd McIntyre. I got my undergraduate degree at CU in 1977. Took off a couple years and entered graduate school in 1979. Graduated in 1986, studying neuroscience. Had originally started studying psychology with the intent of becoming a lawyer, thinking that psychology would be a good background for that endeavor. But after taking some classes that, CU and most universities require you to have a breadth of exposure to different disciplines, I'd taken a class in molecular biology and biological psychology, and that's what I started studying in graduate school at CU. Got my PhD in 1986 and got a phone call from the National Institutes of Health and was offered a position and went there in 1986 to study the pharmacology of the brain, how the brain reacts to various, at a molecular level, various drugs such as barbiturates, benzodiazepines, alcohol, and whatnot. In 1990, started looking around, knew that I did not want to go into academia for several reasons. One of which is that the National Institutes of Health, the extramural program, National Science Foundation, they were only funding about 15 to 20% of the grant applications. And so I asked myself whether I could maintain myself in the top 15% of all neuropharmacologists for the next 30 years. And thought that that would be pretty tough because I knew a lot of the people in the field were very bright and they kept getting their grants renewed, year after year. So started interviewing in the pharmaceutical industry. Over the years, I worked for Hoffmann La Roche, a Swiss company that was doing work in the same area that I had been doing with benzodiazepines, such as Valium and Librium and whatnot. Did pharmacology, toxicology for a couple of years, then started moving into management when I transferred from Hoffmann La Roche to a company called Janssen, which is one of the 250 companies that's owned by Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson is just an umbrella for many, many, many different healthcare companies doing all sorts of things, medical devices, surgical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and whatnot. During that time, I worked on teams that developed some breakthrough drugs such as Risperdal, Consta, Razidine, all for CNS pathophysiologies. Then got recruited to go to Wyeth, which had some CNS drugs called Effexor and Prestique, which I also had the fortune to work on. And then during the last 10 years of my career, I worked as a consultant. Looking back, each of those areas, whether it's academia, government science, such as National Institutes of Health or the Food and Drug Administration, the Center for Disease Control, or if you go into industry, and there are 1,000 different companies in industry, just in the United States, and then there's more so overseas. Each of those areas has pros and cons that you have to weigh in terms of where do you want to go with your career. each has advantages, disadvantages, each has unique opportunities, and each has certain risks. And I'll be glad to talk about those if anyone has any questions. I retired 3 years ago, and I'm enjoying that, but try to keep up by reading the medical journals.
Thank you, Todd, and welcome as well. So I'll jump in with the first question, but of course, we'd love to get questions from the students, and they can be as specific as you want or directed at even one of our panelists. So please just go ahead and throw those in the chat. So let me begin with the panelists, and we can go back in the same order, and ask you. And one of the great things about these panelists is they've had a wide variety of, not just a wide variety across the different panelists in terms of their careers, but many of them, almost all of them, have had numerous different jobs within the field. So they can offer a lot of perspective on this. Tell us a little bit about the entry points for new graduate students who are finishing their degrees, where they should start with that search for a job in this area, and what are the things that they should emphasize about themselves and their skills and their training. So Frank, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, I did unmute. So the good news, I think, is medical affairs, being an MSL, medical science liaison, is the title typically, although there's different titles. It is a growing field, and there's plenty of jobs out there. It's a little bit hard to break in. So what I always tell younger people is, don't be afraid of a contract position. So Amgen's a big company, you know, Merck, Todd mentioned J&J. Those companies will only hire people with experience, but there's a number of small companies that will hire you on a contract basis, which was my first MSL job. I was a contractor. It only lasted about 6 months. I didn't even have that many meetings, but then I got laid off, but then something switched on your resume. Like all of a sudden now you're an MSL. So don't be afraid of those contract jobs. You can build your way up to bigger companies with hopefully more stability. You know, what we're looking for obviously is scientific acumen, which you'll have, but also emotional intelligence, for lack of a better term, you know, kind of interpersonal skills, because you're out there dealing with physicians and nurse practitioners, and some of them are great and some of them are nasty and some of them are mean, you know, and you need to handle all that. Anything you can add to your resume that is sort of customer facing, so to speak, will help. I know, well, we have somebody in Denver, you know, if you wanted to shadow somebody, anything that you can put on your resume, your background that indicates interest, will kind of set you apart a little bit. And then once you break in, it is a good job. It's not, you know, I struggled for a while. I missed data collection. It's not a lab job. But once you break in, it's stable in the sense that you will probably always have another job. You may get laid off a few times. That's the nature of the industry. But don't be afraid of a contract, small company, and then you have that experience. You can continue to build that over time.
Thanks, Frank. Joanna?
Yeah, I'm struggling to think how to answer this question depending on how to define the field. Because the field that I would say I work in is health surveys, and that's pretty narrow. There aren't that many organizations that do that. Ours is, I mean, internationally, UNICEF has a program as well. So if we extend it sort of to international public health, which is maybe a broader category, I think I think probably any of you on this call could do work in that area, because there's so many different types of activities that fall under that, from the data analysis side to writing up reports and results and interpreting data, to if you have a side passion of social media, to communicating, again, data. Let me step back a second and say a lot of what international public health does is to collect data on international topics and health, but also make sure it gets used. And so that's sort of the dream of everybody who's working in an academic lab, I think, is you write that paper and then you want more than just your parents to read it, or at least the abstract. So there are various ways in which you can try to take that information and get it out there and get it used. So I think this, if we were applying specifically to the demographic and health surveys program, we look for people who have statistical experience with statistical packages like Stata and SPSS and SAS, but that's not, I don't have that experience. So I'm an example of you can get a job without that. We look for people with geospatial skills and mapping. We look for people who have lab skills. So really, I guess what I'm saying is that there's a whole gamut, but you've got to tailor your resume to the job. And I would say if you can, network to contact somebody beforehand at the organization just to get a sense. And I'm maybe jumping ahead, but another thing I'd just say is make sure you do your homework before you apply to a job, in looking at as far as you can tell what the job is, but also what the organization does, so that you can, if you do decide to write a cover letter, you can write a good one, or you can be prepared for an interview to talk a bit more about it. I'm going to say there's one other thing, which is that in terms of just general advice that someone once gave me that I found helpful was that a PhD is a license to think. And at first I thought that found that a little insulting, but I think what was meant by that is, of course, you don't need a PhD to think, but it is something that shows that you have this credential, and that is respected widely. And so you can kind of, it proves that you were able to take something from, beginning to end and get that degree, but like go through all those hoops, and that is worth something. So you can leverage that in and of itself, even if you're not using your PhD for the work you're doing day to day. I'll end there.
Thank you, Joanna. That was great. I like the advice of doing your homework on where you're applying. Don?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been shared so far. From my perspective, I've had teams with very diverse experiences. So individuals that led, provider teams, but also individuals that focused on QA and understanding databases and being able to take that information and convert it into data that's actually can then figure out ways to inform both treatment and processes and develop efficiencies for delivering services. Those are all very, very valuable skills. And being able to understand and operate in that, it can be extremely useful. I think a lot of databases, medical databases are SQL based, so that's kind of a useful thing if you're familiar with that or like that. Other things though, it's just such a broad spectrum. Public mental health, community mental health, and health services in general. It's everything from, business development and, being able to manage social media is a big piece. Being able to do that efficiently and effectively is really, really important. Being able to communication skills is probably the number one challenge that we experience hiring people out of academia. You really need to be effective at simple communications like email and phone calls and video calls nowadays, but even more so, being able to convert information on paper and do it succinctly and effectively is really super valuable. And a lot of people really don't make it past the resume test or the cover letter test. So thinking about that, finding out what's important to whoever you're applying to. And the last thing I'll say on this is you really want to have a perspective and a passion for whatever you're looking into as far as a field. Maybe the job itself is entry level and you're not as excited about that, but the agency or the company or the field is something that's really important to you. You have to be able to communicate that. The competition is good. If you get two people who are extremely parallel in their qualifications, one of the primary reasons why you're going to hire one person versus the other is you feel like they're really attached to the mission, attached to the industry, and they're going to be somebody who's going to be there for a long time and really grow. So really thinking about that.
Thank you, Don. And last, Todd.
Yes, a practical suggestion and then more general ideas. The first practical suggestion to get started is everyone has a dissertation. Try to get it published. And then identify who are the references. You're citing other people who have done similar work before you or in parallel to your work in a given field. And they're going to be, you know, maybe 5 people who are doing research, who are heading labs, whether it's in a particular pharmaceutical company or whether it's with the government. And the government is pretty broad, because not only do you have government agencies like the FDA or the Center for Disease Control, but what are called non-governmental organizations that often get their funding from the government, but are independent of the government. And these operate all over the world in all sorts of health issues. So identify some key people, and that's where I would start with applications if you want to go into industry or government work and still do the research about which your dissertation was written. So I would start there. But as others have said, you know, the most important thing is to get your foot in the door of wherever you want to go. You know, once your foot is in the door, then you have an opportunity to demonstrate to people that not only are you a very bright critical thinker, but that you operate very well on teams, because you're going to be working with multidisciplinary teams. You know, in graduate school, you're often doing everything. But when you go into the pharmaceutical industry or the government, for example, you know, the National Institutes of Health has 20,000 people working for them. The Food and Drug Administration, 10,000. So there's many, many opportunities. And getting your foot in the door, operating well on multidisciplinary teams is very important. It was mentioned about communication. The biggest problem in science, regardless of whether it's academia, government, or industry, is communication. A lot of scientists end up working in silos and are ineffective at communicating to the other members of the multidisciplinary team, or with senior management that actually makes the decisions about which way the team or the company is going to go. And as was mentioned before, there are companies like Johnson & Johnson with 150,000 employees and other startup companies that have an idea and have 5 employees. So you get to choose where you want to go. And once you're in the industry or once you're in government, you will be inundated with recruiters who read your LinkedIn profile or get a hold of your CV from someone else. And they will contact you incessantly about, you know, taking your skills to a different place. So in general, communication such as presentation skills, I would take as many opportunities, even if it's not for credit, to polish your presentation skills to large groups, and then writing skills. We're all trained as critical thinkers, but your ability to think critically manifests itself in your writing. And people will read your writing, whether you send it to them as part of one of your key publications, as part of an application, or because you're part of a team in industry. They'll read your writing, and that's where your critical thinking skills manifest. You don't want to just do a data dump in your resume or your application of everything you know. You will want to focus on what that company is looking for. And the final piece of advice is don't worry about your grades. People don't pay attention to them.
Thanks, Todd. Well, worry about your grades a little bit because you do need to finish the degree.
Yes.
Along the lines of what Todd just said, and I'll make a little plug here for the graduate school's 3-minute thesis competition. In terms of presentation skills, I know that graduate students don't always get enough of an opportunity, as Todd was saying, to give a presentation to non-specialists, to folks outside of your discipline. And every year, and we're in the midst of this, and I'll let Sarah talk a little bit about the 3-minute thesis. This is sort of the elevator pitch version of what kind of work you're doing. You have 3 minutes to present your dissertation to folks who are not specialists in your field. Make it interesting, make it fascinating, really. And that's part of selling yourself. So we begin this every fall. Sarah, you might tell a little bit of the details on how they get involved in the 3-minute thesis. And sorry, Sarah Tynan is staff in the graduate school, and she helps with our professional development programs and events.
Yeah. Yeah, so every fall we collect applications from a number of students to participate in the next 3MT cohort. So right now we're in the middle of the cohort. So you can send me an email if you want to be on the list for next year's cohort.
Thank you, Sarah.
Can we add one thing, Scott?
Sure. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, and that is one of the things that scientists have to learn to suppress is writing like it's a novel, in which your conclusions are in the last couple sentences of the discussion section. If you go other places, wherever it is, they want the conclusion up front. So don't write long cover letters or resumes or publications in which your conclusion is in the last couple sentences. Get it up front and then tell people why your conclusion is important. And you need to be able to do that in the outside world. Because the outside world, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, is impatient. They will reward you greatly, but they're impatient. They want to be the first company with a COVID vaccine, and you'll get pushed to be efficient and to get it done.
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate that follow-up. So we do have a question in the chat, and it's specifically aimed at Joanna. And it's a two-parter. What does your average day look like as a senior science advisor for DHS? And specifically, what suggestions would you have for students looking for jobs doing surveys, health surveys, or statistics? And I might add just a tiny bit to that. You mentioned, I think, a little bit of the software, the statistical software like SPSS and SAS. Would you also recommend something like R or Python as well, sort of programming language beyond the statistics?
So yes, it would be the short answer for the programming. That's totally out of my area of expertise, but we do have people with those skills in my office, so it's a yes. So sort of dreading the question about what was my typical day as a senior science advisor, only because it's a relatively new position. I've had it for 2 years, and it was a position that, so with the way our project is structured, USAID is our client, but we work with individual countries, and USAID named this position as something they wanted, and I ended up with the position, but I'd already worked with the organization for a number of years. So let me just say first what I used to do, and then I can talk about senior science advisor. I was a survey manager for a number of years, and in that capacity, I shepherded a country through the process of carrying out a survey. So, I mean, in many ways, it was a great job. We have standard questionnaires that get adapted to a country that's going to carry out a survey, and typically countries carry out surveys every 5 years. So they end up with indicators or information that's comparable over time and across countries. So they can compare themselves to their neighbors, and they can also look to see if things are improving or going downhill over time. And as a survey manager, I would help a country design their or adapt their questionnaire to their particular needs, their particular health infrastructure situation, for example. But I'd go to the country to help train people to be interviewers, to collect biomarkers, which is in our case collecting blood for anemia testing, for HIV testing, malaria testing, et cetera. I'd help them with fieldwork monitoring, writing up results, and disseminating results. So I really got to do a whole host of things, and it was mostly awesome, but it was also a lot of travel, and schedule meant that I would miss a lot of things here because I was traveling for 4 or 5, 6 weeks. In my current job, I'm on the management team. I oversee 2 people who focus specifically on biomarkers, what I just talked about a moment ago. So these are PhD, they're both PhDs who both did postdocs, and then ended up at the Demographic and Health Surveys program, where they are training what we call biomarker technicians, so field workers in a given country to carry out blood collection or testing in the field. And also there's a lab component often where surveys collect blood and do work later in a lab, but it takes place in the country. So I oversee that team. So I help them think through things, and we have projects that are country specific, but we also have things that we're thinking about more project wide or over a work year. So just an example of that is with COVID. COVID has disrupted our work in a lot of ways. One thing we're thinking about is, should we offer, as the science becomes more clear, should we provide the possibility of helping countries measure COVID or SARS-CoV-2 antibody testing if it proves that antibodies are a good thing to test? If antibodies turn out to be useful in measuring, like, someone who is protected against COVID. And so that's something where, like, I'm doing on I shouldn't say day-to-day basis, but it's a project I'm handling right now. But I do a lot of different things in my capacity. I work on managing core documentation in the project. So thinking through questionnaires and coming up with new modules. An example would be HPV, human papillomavirus. Of course, there's a vaccine for that, and it's been distributed more and more in the low and middle income countries. And the question is, how do you measure whether it's getting out and girls are receiving it? And so thinking through how we might help countries capture that information. I haven't answered your second question at all. I will just say that you're welcome to contact me. But if you're looking for jobs in health surveys or health statistics, so there aren't that many health survey programs out there. I mentioned UNICEF runs one called MIX, which stands for Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys. Ours is another one of the biggest ones internationally. The CDC runs a number. Mostly they're focused on national health, but they do international work as well. So it's kind of, there's surveys that do lots and lots of measurements, and there's some that are quite narrow. If you are looking for, in health statistics, there's tons of organizations out there. A lot of them are based in Washington, DC. So there's, people refer to the Beltway bandits, meaning there's lots of groups that provide technical assistance. Some are not for profit, but most are for profit, and they work with the US government. They apply for contracts, and they carry out projects that directly or indirectly benefit the US government by helping countries measure key health statistics. So for suggestions, I'd just say that you should be able to Google and get names of a lot of different companies that are out there, and just start looking to see what kind of jobs you see and what they ask, what the kind of experience they ask for. But again, you're welcome to reach out to me.
Thank you, Joanna. That's great. It's great insights. I know, as someone who also does survey research, that the field of survey research, and I don't do health-related survey work, is just exploded. And my students in political science very, very frequently are able to simply go out and get jobs with those statistical skills, and particularly survey research skills. Just there are many, many companies and firms that are just doing all kinds of survey work. There's a lot of opportunity for that right now. So let me briefly introduce Kat Diebel-Wilson. Kat is with Career Services, and they're partnered with us in presenting these panels. And I'm going to turn it over to her for a couple of things. One is to tell folks who may not, students who may not be familiar with what Career Services provides for our graduate students. So to talk a little bit about specifically the things that Kat does, because she's oriented toward helping graduate students find careers. So she'll just very briefly talk about some of the things that they provide. And then perhaps, because Kat has a lot of experience connecting our graduate students with careers outside of academia, she can ask something of our panelists as well. So Kat.
Yes, hi. So Career Services offers a lot of programming every year, in addition to, of course, partnering with the grad school on events like this. I also just wrapped my 8-week industry job search seminar, which I'll be offering again in the spring, beginning beginning February 2nd. And of course, the 8-week academic job search seminar in the summer, and all of those will be on our event calendar. We also offer a lot of employer events. So if you're curious if a company you're interested in is coming to see you, please do check out our events page on Handshake. That can be a really great way to connect with employers. And of course, we also do one-on-one career advising sessions with graduate students, and to book those, just hit our main page and talk to one of our scheduling professionals through live chat. They're not robots, I promise. I think that something that I'm really curious about for our panelists is, can you give me 1 or 2 skills that you look for on the resume of a candidate, and maybe even a little bit about why that's important?
So Kat, I guess we'll keep the same order. So I'll go. I think so. I think Todd hit on some of them that are critical for us. Writing is big, depending on this. You know, if you're at a big pharma company, you're going to have a very narrow role. If you're at a smaller company, you're going to maybe do different things. And I'm amazed. And now I'm going to sound like an old guy, but I will see people's writing with doctorates, and they mix up THERE and TIGIR, and working on your writing is key. Presenting is also huge. So our job is essentially presenting to people all day, 1 to 100, 30 seconds to an hour. So again, presenting as much as you can. If you can give a guest lecture at Front Range or something, any presentation skills is good. And like I said, any shadowing or any customer centered or customer focused experience that makes you, everyone on the application pool is going to have a doctorate. What's going to make you look a little bit different is going to help.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate it. Joanna?
Yeah, I think I gave some of mine already, but I have a few more. So we always, sort of a joke when we've interviewed someone, we're always looking for people with survey experience, and we almost never get anyone with survey experience. And I was that way, I had none. So it's always sort of like, they don't have any survey experience. Well, we never hire people with survey experience. So don't let that stop you. But we look for people, I mean, we're always sort of, in addition to such a variety of things that I mentioned before, data processing, I think statistical analysis, geospatial are all avenues to get into my group, but also languages. If you speak a language, advertise that. Don't over advertise it. Don't sell it like, yeah, I took high school French and I speak French, because the expectation, people will be very disappointed. But if you do, speak a language well or can write in it, advertise that. If you have experience training people, and many graduate students, of course, have taught a class or two. The bigger the better for my organization, and the more experience the better, but definitely highlight that. And then because of COVID and with everything sort of pivoting to more online things, we're really interested in people who have an interest or skill in online learning, in sort of transferring what we've always done in the past in person to virtual. So I would, if you have any experience in that or interest, go for it. And I also am old school, like Frank. It does drive me crazy when I see spelling errors and just typos on a CV. I think if we want someone who's focused on data quality and they can't get their CV right, like, ugh, it does drive me insane.
Yeah, and so I guess in addition to that, I would, as this is done, in addition to that, I would add, if you can think about your resume as presenting an argument for why you'd be a good fit for wherever you're going, because you know you, and you can see your resume and look at it and say, this is something that shows I'm qualified. You're competing against, 20 or 30 other people who are also coming from that perspective. The ones that rise to the top are the ones where you look at it as a potential employer and you see a fit. You see, this makes sense. This would be somebody who would be able to add something that's critical to our team. They're presenting it really in a concise, clear way. And again, they demonstrate a passion or real interest in whatever you do. So those are the people who sort of rise to the top. Those are the ones who get interviews. Communication, I mean, everywhere I go, all executives I talk to, it's the number one challenge that managers have, is bringing in people who are effective communicators, and being able to present information concisely, but really effectively. So that is top of the list. The only other thing I would say is, quite frankly, having some sort of professional, or at least professional leaning experience with social media is something where it is where everything is going. It sounds silly to talk about things like TikTok. I know lots and lots of industries which are trying to figure out ways to capitalize on that. So trying to figure out what that looks like and how you can make that an asset to you, and not something where people are just trying to see if you're, doing something that would get you in trouble or get them in trouble, but actually show, I can actually do a presentation in a really effective way to sort of drum up some interest in something that's value added, or that might be able to help me to think about how to make that value added, would be really, really useful.
Thank you, Don. And I'll turn it over to Todd. And just as a side note, Todd, Calvin, one of the students on the call, wanted to know if there were specific skills for these industry medical liaison positions that you're looking for.
Well, I can address a few things, but I think Frank is the medical science liaison. I've interacted with MSLs over the years, but I have not worked in that area. To the broader question about skills, communication is absolutely essential, and it's not unique to health careers. It's telecommunication, whatever industries you're in, human beings tend not to communicate effectively. Even in your relationships with other people, relationships run into problems because of communication skills. And it's at a much higher level than you'll experience in academia. Academia, you can write an article and you can drill down into the minute details about how you did a particular experiment and how somebody else did a similar experiment that supports your conclusions. But you have to have, in industry and in government, you have to have broader communication skills. I think it was Scott that said you have to be able to communicate to very bright people who don't have the same minute training that you have. So you might be communicating to physicians who are looking to you to say, What type of adverse events, if I'm doing eye surgery or if I'm doing oncology research, how does your research help me predict how my experiment's going to come out? And so you have to communicate to bright people who don't need to know the details of your research, but they need to know the conclusions. Other things to think about in preparation for your career, when you're in industry, there are a million doors to open. There are many companies, many jobs within each company. Leadership, if you show leadership skills on a particular team, if you're able to sway the rest of the team to go in a certain direction, people will talk about your leadership skills. So if you had a week to spare in your busy careers, there are leadership institutes out there that will take you through a lot of important and useful information about how to become a leader within a scientific community. Other things we've talked about, statistics and things like that. Experimental design in the pharmaceutical industry. Many clinical trials turn up negative or turn up inconclusive. And they're very, very expensive to run these clinical trials because there are doctors out there in various hospitals or medical schools who you hire to do this broad-based clinical research. Maybe you have a new cardiovascular drug and you have 5,000 patients in the trial. Well, that's going to research at 100 different clinical centers. So experimental design is critical to prevent the inconclusive study that just cost your company $10 million. Also, I've gone to the Food and Drug Administration and their counterparts around the world, Japan, Canada, Europe, and they say, well, these are great clinical studies, but they don't answer the important questions. So experimental design and analysis and how to make sure you're on the same page with the rest of your team, with management, and with health authorities around the world who are the final arbiter of whether your team has succeeded in convincing them that a particular drug has the right benefit risk for a particular condition. Those are all essential skills that will do well as you proceed.
Thank you, Todd. I appreciate that. Before I ask the last question, since we only probably have a minute for one last quick question, we're going to ask for feedback from the students on this because we want to know what went well and what didn't. Also, what else you want to know, either from panelists like these or perhaps a panel you can suggest that we hold in the future. Sarah, is there anything they need to know about the feedback?
Yeah, so I'm going to put the survey in the chat right now.
And then they just fill that out?
Yep. So
Okay.
there's the link to the survey, and go ahead, just click on that link and it'll give you some options. Basically, we're just looking for what can we do to improve and what did we do well that you found beneficial so that we can improve these panels for you in the future.
Thank you, Sarah. So one last quick question. We only have a few minutes left. And it's sort of what one piece of advice would you have that you think our graduate students or students in PhD programs, what mistake would they make in presenting themselves that they should avoid? So maybe something they shouldn't put on their resume or something they shouldn't say in an interview. So what thing would you recommend that they try to avoid? Frank?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I would flip it and reiterate what we've said, that, everybody, if I put a job out there, there's going to be 100 applicants, they're all going to have PhDs. What makes you different? Emphasize your communication skills, your flexibility in communication, your additional project work, working in teams, all that. Don't just think, hey, I have a PhD from CU. Well, there's 45 other people that have that too. So what else do you have that makes you stand out?
Joanna?
I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question exactly, but my response was going to be, project confidence, but don't be afraid to admit what you don't know. So if that's in an interview, it's okay. You're not going to know everything, but it's great in an interview is going well when someone asks good questions. So I mentioned doing your homework, but also listening and responding to what the conversation is and asking good questions is really great, because then that's part of the communication, right? No one wants just people to falsely say that they've got something under control when they are hired, when they don't. So also when you get hired, my advice would be, don't be afraid to admit what you don't know. And people are often willing to help, but you have to go out and find them often. There's not the same kind of mentor relationship usually that you have when you're in grad school.
Don?
Yeah, and I just like to piggyback off of that. Even if there's not a job, but there's an industry that you're interested in, reach out to people. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I've always found people can be incredibly generous. They'll give you 10, 15 minutes. They'll tell you a little bit about kind of the field. They'll tell you a little bit about entry points, and tell you about what's important. Don't be afraid to ask questions. A lot of times we sort of answer it in our head, and we really created our own barrier. The only other thing I'd say is manage your social media. You are 100% transparent in public, and one way or another, people are going to look you up. So if that doesn't present the way you're trying to present yourself for potential employers, think about it through their eyes. It's super, super important.
Thanks, Don. And last, Todd?
Yeah, I'd like to start with my earlier comment about grades, Scott. The flip side of that coin is that the most important thing are your publications, wherever they are, showing good critical thinking skills, good communication skills, not just a series of true sentences, but a certain flow and logic to the structure of your writing. But the most important thing, as everyone has said, there's lots of people that are going to be competing with you. So an absolutely critical piece of initiating your career is a letter of recommendation, although nowadays, for legal reasons, almost everyone does phone interviews. So you need to have someone behind you, be it your thesis advisor or somebody that's not your thesis advisor, but is a big name in your department. Write a letter that says you're the best thing since sliced bread. That person has had many, many graduate students and postdocs, and you stand out in the top 3. That's the kind of letter you need. And then when you get the interview, as others have said, you want to be enthusiastic and confident, but don't overtalk. Listen to the person interviewing you. Many of them are not